Before starting, do not forget to subscribe the channel. Well, we start anime, which begins with the fact that we are introduced to the main characters. Their name is Edward and Alphonse Elriki. More recently, the father left their family, which is why the mother became many times more difficult to raise children and monitor the house. Nevertheless, the children adopted the father's love for science and delved into the study of alchemy, the main rule of which is an equivalent exchange. That is, creating something out of nothing is simply impossible. Unfortunately, the mother fell ill, and therefore soon died. The brothers could not come to terms with loss. Therefore, we went to students to a local alchemist to improve their skills, but they needed to transmut. In simple words, they wanted to resurrect their mother, that in the world of alchemy is a ban on number one. Of course, no prohibitions worried them, and therefore ultimately they tried to resurrect their mother. They resurrected to resurrect, but instead of a mother, they saw something terrible. Because of this, something Alphonse had to give his body. To save his brother, Edward gave his hand and leg, thereby sealed his brother's soul in armor. Nevertheless, in return, Edward recognized the truth, that is, acquired the ability to alchemy, which gave him a certain deity. Because of this, a grandmother named Pinnock takes the guys under her wing, and she makes Edward prostheses. Pinnock also has a granddaughter named Winry, who had his parents, and therefore having experienced so many losses, the guys became even closer. The state learned about what happened, after which Edward invited to become a state alchemist, because such talent cannot be lost. Roy Mustang, one of the strongest state alchemists, personally came to invite the guys. He understood that in the service the guys could face a real hell. But after everything that they experienced, they are probably ready for everything. Edward agrees to this, because in this way, he will gain access to a heap of information that he must use to return his body to Alphonse. Having passed the exam, he received the title of Steel Alchemist, and immediately after that the Elric brothers went home to burn him, thereby leaving his way back. And now their main goal is to find a Philosopher's Stone, with the help of which you can significantly strengthen your alchemy. That's just now they need to solve one urgent problem. The first state-owned person, named King Bradley, is going to attack an alchemist desert named Isaac. Many officers were sent to his capture, but killing state alchemists, Aldi was getting closer to his goal. Finally, he was found by the Elriki brothers, after which we learn that, because of his prosthesis, Edward can use alchemy without drawing special circles, although others cannot boast of the same. They catch him, but refuse to kill him, which is why Isaac manages to escape. But this led to the fact that Bradley personally came out against Isaac, who is dealing with him without any problems. Nevertheless, the main goal of the brothers remains the same, namely, the Philosopher's Stone, for which they went to the city of Lyre. There they discovered a priest named Cornell, whom the whole city considered the messenger of God, but the Elrics realized that he has a Philosopher's Stone, which means Cornell is an ordinary alchemist who hangs noodles on their ears. Trying to meet with him, the brothers come across a girl named Rosa, who is insanely strongly believed that Cornella is the messenger of God. The fact is that her groom died, and knowing this, Cornell told her that he could return him to life. Of course, Edward tried to explain to her that human transmutation was simply impossible, but the Rose refused to believe in this. Be that as it may, Elrics penetrate to Cornell, where they noticed a Philosopher's Stone on his finger. Not wanting to see alchemists in his city, Cornell orders them to kill them, but all the attacks of Elric easily reflect. Because of what Cornell causes a chimera, that is, a cross-lion with other animals. But her Edward also wins, which greatly surprises Cornell. After that, Edward shows his prostheses, saying that he was already trying to return to the life of a dead person, which is why the Rose is shocked. In panic, Cornell is trying to use the philosophical stone again, but it does not withstand and simply destroy, which means that this cannot be a real philosophical stone. At the same time, the townspeople heard what was happening in the church, after which they came to the realization that Cornello is an ordinary fraudster, and therefore riots begin in the city. Having lost precious time, the Elrics were going to leave, but the shocked Rose instructed them a gun. Upon learning that Cornell was deceiving her, she lost her faith, which very much hit her condition, but even so Elric needed to move on. Cornella, on the other hand, took up mortal sins, namely lust and hunger, which, as it turns out, just gave him a fake philosophical stone. Meanwhile, in the capital, a certain Scar kills a state officer. It turns out that he has long been catching and killing state officers. And not wanting to endure the losses, Hughes and Armstrong were sent to search for him. While they understand, Roy Mustang decides to help Elric. He shows them a scientist who was one of a kind in his kind to create a chimera who understands human speech. True, she spoke only one thing, namely, that she wants to die, until ultimately she committed suicide. His name is Tucker, and he shows the children his vast library, where they can find some information about the Philosopher's Stone. While they are looking for information, a daughter of Tucker named Nina came to them. Due to the fact that Tucker is constantly busy, she has to play with her dog, so she was madly glad that new guests entered them home. And let the Elriki be focused on their goals, they are still children. And from time to time they played with Nina and the dog. Tucker did not have time for a reason. The fact is that the state license needs to be renewed every year, but for this it is necessary. The opening that Tucker did not make from the moment of talking chimera. There is very little time left, and if he cannot extend his license, then he will lose financing, and therefore a carefree life. That is why he is so desperately trying to achieve new discoveries. One day, Elriki again come to Takara, who proudly shows them a new speaker. The problem is that this chimera, well, was too much like his daughter Nina. After which Edward realizes that his wife was the first speaker's chimera. And in order not to lose the license, he made the second already his daughter. Having faded, Edward began to beat Tucker, but he no longer worried because he achieved his goals. Highly shocked, Elric's go away, while the Tucker is taken into custody. But he did not live to see the trial, because the Screamer copes first with him, and then with Nina so that she does not suffer. Following the Scar-attacked Elrikov, Edward and Alphonse are considered quite strong guys, but even together, they could not contrast him with anything. Moreover, he was already close to killing them. However, at the last moment, state officers intervened. Roy Mustang could not help them, because his strength does not work in the rain. But others were able to make the Scar run to the sewer. After which it turns out that the Scar is ISHVAR at. More recently, there was a civil war, during which state alchemists on orders exterminated the people of Ishvar, while at some point nothing was left of them. The Ishwars possess the body much better than an ordinary person, and therefore, in the battle alone, they will almost always come out winners, but they could not do anything against alchemy. Of course, the Scar fucked up a huge hatred, and therefore made a promise to destroy every state alchemist. Following his goal, he almost killed Edward and Alphonse, and therefore with huge mechanical wounds, they went to their mechanics, namely Winry. Due to the recent attempt, the guys were presented to the guards in the form of an alchemist of Armstrong. They rode by train, and on the way Armstrong met Mark, a former state alchemist, who was immediately hiding at the sight of the guys. According to Armstrong, Mark is a biological alchemist, and during the war at Ishvar, he conducted research in the field of creating a philosophical stone, which means that Mark can help Elrica very much. Having come to him, Mark immediately refuses to help them because such terrible information should not fall into the hands of partners. However, having learned that they survived the human transmutation, he still decides to tell them about the Philosopher's Stone. According to him, all basic information is hidden in the library of the central city, but he also warns that a real Philosopher's Stone cannot be created without a victim. What kind of victims he does not tell, but nevertheless, Elrikov did not stop it, so they continued their way to Winry. Pinocchio and Winry help Edward to restore his hand, after which Edward himself began to restore Alfonso's armor, because no one can do this besides him and his alchemy. Having finished the case, the guys return to the central city, where they find out that the section of the first library he needed burned during a recent attack. For their luck, they meet a girl named Shijas, a former librarian, dismissed that she had only read all the time. It turns out that she just has a phenomenal memory, and she remembers absolutely every book that she has ever read, and she also remembers the treatise, which was right for the children. It took a lot of time to restore it, but as a result, the guys got what they were looking for, namely, a book with food recipes. At first, they were already dressed, but Edward realized that such important information could not be left in sight, which means that the book is the cipher, which the guys began to study. While they were versed, lust and hunger attacks the Scars, but he still manages to escape. This cipher took a lot of time and effort, but finally deciphering the treatise, they recognize the terrible truth. As it turns out, the same victim for the study of the philosophical stone was Schwartz. Also in the records, a certain laboratory 5. Located next to the prison, is mentioned. Not a word about this laboratory from the authorities, but for some reason, state alchemists are prohibited there. Edward collided with a number 48, and Alphonse will fight the 66th. As it turns out, they, like Alphonse, souls, chained in armor, which the government forced to protect this place. According to the 48th, they are former prisoners, from which, using as victims, they made a philosopher's stone. At the same time, the 66 number begins to morally put pressure on Alphonse, telling him that since he was chained to the armor, it is quite possible he was never a real person, and all his memories are only the merit of Edward, who just uses him. Alphonse tried to answer him, but the words of the 66th still sunk into his head. With the help of the tricks and technology of Shrama, Edward nevertheless defeated the 48th, after which he was about to interrogate him. However, at that moment Lust appears with envy and kills the 48th, so that he does not tell anything. Next, they blow up the laboratory, but for some reason they previously take out from their Edward, because as it turns out, they need something for something in the future. After the incident, the Elrics were hospitalized. Because of this, Edward had to be called to the city of Winry, because without it he cannot recover. At this time, Alphonse began to drive even more because of the words of the 66th. Edward notes his strange behavior, but not knowing the reason, he cannot act on him in any way. Since Winry has nowhere to live, Hughes sheltered her, because this is also an occasion to invite someone for his beloved daughter's birthday. Taking this opportunity, Winry begins to complain to Hughes that Elrics never tell her about his affairs, to which Hughes replies that men often hide their problems from all, and the fact that they do not devote their affairs only means that they do not want to load her once again. Meanwhile, the experience of Alphonse reached the limit, because of which he breaks down at Edward, but he, without saying anything, just leaves. Instead, Winry answered, saying that only the last idiot would deprive himself of his limb and will risk every day with his own head for the well-being of an artificially created armor. Thanks to Winry to Alphonse, it finally reaches that he is really a person, after which he finds Edward and apologizes to him. At the same time, the Scar wakes up in the camp of the surviving Eshvers. Just by the way, the bandits attack them, but even the exhausted Scar straightens with them. Despite the recent war, the Eshvers do not want even more bloodshed. Therefore, walking along the path of revenge, the Scar does not do better, but he does not plan to refuse it. Now, in principle, the situation is some kind of tense, and this is once again confirms King Bradley, who secretly visits Elriki, saying that they are careful with all the military, because he still does not know how deep the enemy could penetrate. All this forces Elriki to go to W's, hoping to learn more about Philosophical Stone, because their teacher lives in this city. Upon learning of this, Winry decides to go with them, as the city of Rashwell, known for its masters of the Autobroni, is on the way to W's. And because Winry also wants to constantly improve in his business, she will go with them. While the guys are on the way, Hughes continues to investigate, during which he finds a connection between the uprising in Lyre, the 5th laboratory, and the war in Ishvar. That's just that he only entered into the danger. Having learned what he should not, Lust attacks Hughes. Having escaped from her, Hughes was about to tell about the whole Mustang, but he was killed by envy right in a telephone booth. He was posthumously promoted to the title of Brigade General, but this, of course, did not comfort his wife and daughter. Roy Mustang could not leave the death of a close friend, so he personally took up this matter. And thanks to the hints of Armstrong, he understands that someone from the leadership of the army may be involved in the murder of Hughes. At this time, who did not know about the tragedy, the guys had already arrived in Rashwell, where a thief named Panina instantly steals Edward's watches, which are a sign of the state alchemist for a second. They immediately rushed after her, but thanks to their prostheses, the Panin could easily run away from them. Because of this, Edward had to use alchemy, and therefore ultimately they overtook it, but they were not going to punish it somehow, because by theft she simply tried to feed herself. She turns out to be the adoptive daughter of an Autobroni mechanic named Dominic, whose work Winry instantly fell in love, because of which she asked for students, but Dominic immediately refuses her. As it turns out, Dominic found a Fester Panin when she was still small. Despite his strict disposition, he constantly cares about her. And according to Winry, Paninin does his theft only worse, because Dominic helped her from a pure heart, which means she should answer the same, so she nevertheless returns Edward's watch. Due to the curiosity, the girls decide to open his watch, where they find a date symbolizing the day when the Elrics burned their house and vowed to return their bodies for autopsy. Edward became furious, saying that this watch is not just a thing, but a reminder of pain and responsibility, thereby forcing a pony to regret the theft. Meanwhile, at the daughter-in-law of Dominic, childbirth begins. Because of the weather, it is impossible to take it to the hospital, so Dominic urgently went after the doctor, while the guys stayed with the woman. The situation reached the limit, and therefore Winry had to take birth, which, as a result, she did a great job. With this act, she greatly impressed the Dominic, but he still refuses to take her as a student, but in gratitude she directs her to an excellent mechanics, from which she can study. Having achieved her own, Winry remained in Rashville, and the Elriki went further to Dububes. Finally, having reached, the brothers envelop the fear, because their teacher has a very cupboard character. It turns out that this powerful alchemist teacher is a housewife named Izumi. When they saw each other for the last time, Alphonse still had his body, and therefore she quickly realized that they tried to transmute a person, because of which she came into incredible rage. Nevertheless, according to Izumi, once after such the guys remained alive, then most likely they were chosen by truth. In order to get more information about the philosophical stone, Elric remains to live with her, during which they recall how exactly the brothers became her students. As it turns out, Izumi always tried to hide her skills in alchemy, showing herself to an ordinary housewife. But one of these rare cases of the use of alchemy was seen by the Elric brothers, after which they immediately began to ask her students. Izumi was not going to train anyone, but having learned that the brothers had recently become orphans, Sting, and took them as students. As the first test, she left them to survive for a month on an uninhabited island, saying that after the expiration of the term, they should explain to her the meaning of the phrase "one thing and everything is one." At first, Elriki behaved too softly, and therefore could not really hunt animals. However, hunger very quickly changed their thinking, after which they began to survive, during which they understood that plants, insects, animals, and people are connected through the cycle of substances, which means this is the relationship of metabolism, and there is the meaning of alchemy. The interference was accepted and began to train their answer. At present, Izumi tells why she fell so much on Elrikov for violation of the rule. It turns out that Izumi and her husband Seek tried to have a child for a very long time, and after a bunch of time, Izumi finally became pregnant, but only this child was born dead. Complete despair, Izumi tried to transmute her child, for which she paid part of her internal organs. In connection with the latest events, Izumi announces Elric that they will no longer be her students. Hearing this, the brothers were very upset, but as Seek later explained to them, this only means that from that moment they are equal to the Izumi. Meanwhile, a Greed appeared in Douglas, who was very interested in the soul of Alphonse. He ordered his gang, which are chimeras, to grab and bring him Alphonse. Their cunning is obtained, and it turns out that Greed is interested in immortality. Now he can regenerate from any injuries, but be that as it may, his body is aging. Therefore, knowledge of how to attach your soul to armor, it seems to him, will help to acquire immortality. But Alphonse does not possess such information, because Edward was engaged in all this, who, incidentally, began to worrying about the loss of his brother, and therefore went in search. When Edward finally found them, Greed offered him a deal, instead of meaningless violence, to exchange information for information. If Edward tells how he attached the soul of Alfonso to the armor, then the Greed tells how to create homunculus. Despite this, Edward refuses, entering into battle with Greed. To his surprise, Greed could completely regenerate his body, and moreover, it can be covered with armor, which is extremely difficult to break through. But even so, Edward was able to inflict damage to him, even if he received a bunch of injuries for this. Surprisingly, Izumi enters this battle, saving Edward, but even more surprising is the fact that soldiers from the central city under the command of Bradley Cooper himself arrived to clean up this place. Armstrong and other soldiers are completely changing the course of the battle, because of which Greed has to run, while having managed to take Alfonso with them, but they quickly catch up with Bradley, which is not a person. And he begins with incredible cruelty over and over again to kill Greed, turning this fight into torture. Heimers came running to help their leader, but their Bradley instantly kills. All this time in Alfonso's body was a girl, whom Alfonso tried with all his might from Bradley, but not wanting to see the death of his comrades. She also rushed into battle, for which she also paid her life. Her blood fell on the blood sign of Alfonso, after which he recalls that he, like Edward, saw the truth. Nevertheless, the brothers Elric was completely incomprehensible why a whole army came to such a trifling business, and led by Bradley himself. But they did not have time to think normally, because from Armstrong they will learn about the death of Hughes. After that, it turns out that Brawley, like Allness, is a homunculus, namely anger, and which was created by a certain named father, which was very similar to Elrikov's dad. He said that he was ready to forgive the alliness of his betrayal if he changes, but according to the Aloynus, he is so angry, and therefore he simply cannot dance according to someone's god. And therefore his father spreads him and returns his body. The first part ends on this, but what will happen next we will find out in the next part, the video about which will be released someday tomorrow. Do not forget to make likes and subscribe to my YouTube, but see you in the next video.